So, how did one of the world's largest economies manage to navigate those really treacherous waters of market reform, without falling into the kind of economic chaos that we saw happen elsewhere?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's exactly what we're diving into today.
This deep dive is all about China's, well, incredibly unique path to market reform back in the 1980s. Specifically, how it managed to avoid those devastating pitfalls of shock therapy, the kind that, really hammered other transitioning economies, like Russia, for example.
Exactly. Our mission today really is to unpack the intellectual foundations, the historical precedents, and the very practical decisions that let China integrate into global capitalism while still holding on to a significant degree of economic sovereignty.
And you'll discover how amazingly ancient Chinese philosophy ended up shaping modern economic policy.
Right. And why some of the most prominent Western economists found China's approach so, well, challenging to grasp. It really flew in the face of conventional wisdom at the time.
It really did. So our main source for this is Isabella Weber's fantastic book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, The Market Reform Debate. It's packed with interviews, historical documents, economic analysis, really in-depth stuff.
And we'll also touch upon some classic Chinese texts, things like the Guanzi and the Salt and Iron debate, and even, interestingly, American economic experiences from World War II.
It's a truly fascinating story. Okay, let's get started.
Right.
So to really appreciate China's path, I think it helps to first understand what shock therapy actually was, because it's such a stark contrast. Could you maybe lay out the core ideas for us?
Sure. So, at its heart, shock therapy is basically this comprehensive package of economic reforms. The key is they're implemented simultaneously, like all at once, and very, very rapidly.
Okay.
Its main focus is on radical price liberalization. That means just abruptly removing all price controls across the board. And that's usually coupled with really strict austerity measures, cutting government spending, tightening money supply.
And people like Lipton and Sachs were big proponents.
Yes, David Lipton and Jeffrey Sachs were key figures. And they acknowledged it was a huge challenge, especially privatization in economies where almost everything was state-owned. But they still pushed for this rapid, big bang approach to freeing up prices.
Why? What was the thinking there?
They saw it as an essential first step. Like, you had to liberalize prices before you could effectively privatize state industries or open up to international trade. It was seen as the necessary precondition.
So it sounds like it was really more than just tweaking the economy.
Oh, much more. And this is often overlooked. Proponents saw it as demanding a revolutionary change in institutions.
Right.
And, Lipton and Sachs explicitly said the collapse of the one-party rule was the sine qua non, the absolute necessity for a successful transition to a market economy.
Wow, so that political dimension was really explicit, not just an unintended consequence.
Absolutely explicit. The kind of transformation they were prescribing wasn't just economic, it really demanded a complete political overhaul as well.
And Russia's experience really serves as a cautionary tale here, doesn't it? It shows just how destructive this approach could actually be.
It really does. It's a vivid illustration of the risks.
So what happened when Russia implemented shock therapy?
Well, after the Soviet state collapsed in December '91, Boris Yeltsin, the new Russian president, eliminated almost all price controls basically overnight on January 2nd, 1992.
Just like that.
Just like that. It's interesting, actually, because under Gorbachev, they'd considered radical price reform repeatedly since '87, but it never fully happened. There was too much public opposition, warnings about social unrest. Gorbachev had actually tried for a more gradual, sort of Chinese-style approach in some ways, but it just didn't get implemented broadly.
So Yeltsin went for the big bang. And what was the result? The immediate outcome and maybe the longer term?
Well, instead of the predicted one-time price jump followed by stability.
Which was the theory.
Which was the theory, yes. Instead, Russia got hit with this prolonged period of incredibly high inflation, and at the same time, a really severe drop in economic output. And then afterwards, just consistently low growth rates for years.
And the human cost.
Devastating. Beyond the economic numbers, most measures of human well-being, access to education, poverty levels, public health, they just collapsed. And it wasn't just Russia. Many post-socialist countries that tried some form of shock therapy went through these deep, prolonged recessions. It really showed the profound human cost of trying to transition that quickly.
That's just, yeah, a truly devastating picture. And it makes you wonder, were there external factors that maybe made such radical changes possible, or maybe even necessary? The source material mentions this idea of limited sovereignty sometimes being a condition, citing things like the German reforms in '48 or the Dodge Line in Japan.
That's a really crucial point. The book suggests that these kinds of radical measures often require a context where national sovereignty is somehow limited. Maybe external pressures, post-war situations, something that makes these sweeping, really painful reforms politically feasible.
So it's not just an internal economic choice.
Often not. It's frequently influenced by wider geopolitical realities. And that external context is important when we contrast it with China's path, where its sovereignty wasn't really challenged in the same way during its reform period.
Okay, that distinction is key. Now, let's pivot to China's own history. What's really fascinating, and you mentioned this earlier, is how China's approach seems rooted in these ancient traditions. It really challenges that Western-centric view that, only the Greeks and Romans had worthwhile economic ideas.
It's quite remarkable, isn't it? And it wasn't just an academic curiosity. During the Reform era in the late 1970s, there was this resurgence of studies looking at Chinese classics like the Guanzi or the salt and iron debate.
And this was linked to the reform discussions.
Directly linked. Scholars and policymakers were actively looking back into their own intellectual heritage for guidance on modern economic problems. They weren't just importing ideas, they were excavating their own.
Let's dig into the Guanzi then. What exactly is this text, and what are these famous light-heavy principles all about?
Right, the Guanzi. It's
Yeah.
one of the largest ancient Chinese texts we have. It's basically a collection of writings thought to be from state planners and economic advisors during the Warring States period. That's before China was unified.
A time of chaos, then.
Huge upheaval. The old Zhou dynasty's strict central control had broken down. You saw the emergence of free trade, coinage, private merchants. It was a dynamic but also unstable time, and rulers were desperately looking for new ways to manage the economy and maintain control.
So the Guanzi wasn't just philosophy, it was a practical response to these big economic and social shifts.
Exactly. And its core concept, this light-heavy idea, or gingzong in Chinese, is really quite advanced for its time.
How does it work? It's not about equilibrium, you said.
No, not like modern neoclassical economics thinks about static equilibrium. It's about understanding dynamic changes in supply and demand. The state uses what is heavy, meaning things that are valued, scarce, important to balance or offset what is light, things that are cheap, abundant, maybe less essential. It's about actively managing these fluctuations.
The text gives an example, right? Like, an urgent decree to collect tax in the form of certain goods will make the goods in question heavy, but a go-slow decree will make them light. That sounds incredibly modern, almost like a concept of a demand shock created by policy itself.
It absolutely is. It shows its understanding that government actions, like tax policies, directly influence prices and market dynamics, what we call a demand shock today. And the Guanzi explicitly advised the state to make use of what is valued to acquire what is not valued and what has been acquired cheaply to ease the price of what has become too expensive.
So it's active market management by the state. What was the ultimate goal?
The fundamental idea was that the government has a responsibility to stabilize grain prices. Grain was key. Stabilize grain, and you stabilize the overall price level, which in turn ensures the value of money.
And how did they propose doing this?
Through what the text calls the art of planned fiscal management. The idea was to enrich the country without resorting to heavy direct taxation, which causes resentment. Instead, the state acts as a benevolent government.
How so?
By participating in the market. It would sell grain from state reserves when prices got too high, pushing them down. And it would buy grain when prices fell too low, supporting farmers and building up reserves. It smooths out the fluctuations. And the state generates revenue through these timely interventions, not by just taking from people.
Creating stability, like placing a square object on the ground, as the text says. It's a very early, very sophisticated concept of state-led market stabilization.
It really is a deep-seated view of the state's active, stabilizing role.
Okay, let's move forward a bit in history to another crucial moment. The salt and iron debate in 81 BCE. This sounds like a major clash of ideas. Could you unpack this for us?
Yes, this was a really significant debate held right in the imperial court. It pitted Sang Hongyang, who was a prominent official, kind of a merchant bureaucrat type, and a big advocate for state monopolies against a group known as the literati idealists, who wanted a much more minimalist government role.
And Sang Hengyang was defending Emperor Wu's policies of state control over key resources.
Exactly. He had implemented policies to centralize state control, especially over salt and iron, which were vital commodities.
What was his core argument? Why did he think these state monopolies were so important?
He had several key reasons. First, fiscal revenue. These monopolies brought essential money into the state treasury, preventing financial instability, especially needed for things like frontier defense. Second, stability. He argued they prevented speculation by private merchants, which could drive prices way up, ensuring stable access to essentials like salt and iron tools for farmers.
And he also argued for efficiency.
Yes, quite remarkably, he put forward what might be the earliest exposition on the superiority of large-scale production over small-scale production in Chinese history. He argued state-run operations were better equipped, had more capital, better artisans for these complex industries compared to small private producers.
But the literati idealists obviously disagreed strongly. What was their critique?
They were vehemently opposed. They argued these monopolies led to widespread corruption among officials, that the goods produced by the state were often low quality, weren't conveniently supplied to the peasants, or were sold at inflated prices.
What was their alternative vision?
They wanted a return to what they saw as an idealized past, a society based on ritual order, simple subsistence agriculture, and a really minimalist government that didn't interfere much in the economy. For them, the rise of commerce and money was actually a kind of moral degeneration.
So, a clash between pragmatism and idealism in a way. What was the outcome? Who won the debate?
Well, Sang's policies largely stayed in place, even though he himself was executed shortly after the debate for political reasons. The salt and iron monopolies and his price stabilization policies continued.
Interesting.
They were eventually eroded much later due to government crises, not because people suddenly rejected the theory behind them. And this whole episode demonstrated a key practical point. It's really difficult to just privatize large-scale, technologically complex industries at a stroke, as the book puts it. Trying to dismantle these integrated systems rapidly could cause massive disruption.
So this debate really highlights two recurring themes in Chinese history, doesn't it? You have the realist, pragmatic approach like the Guanzi, like Sang Hengyang, focused on using state power to manage market forces for stability. And then you have the idealist approach of the literati, wanting to return to a simpler, more moralistic past.
Exactly. And these two visions, even though they clashed, often kind of nourished one another over the centuries, shaping a uniquely Chinese tradition of economic statecraft that wasn't purely one thing or the other.
And the ever-normal granary system is a concrete example of this lasting pragmatism.
Absolutely. It's a perfect example. This system, where the state buys grain when it's plentiful and cheap and sells it when it's scarce and expensive, persisted for centuries as a tool for stabilizing prices. Remarkably, even in the 1940s, under the nationalists, some local governments were still using these principles. It shows just how deep-rooted this idea of state market management was.
That history provides such crucial context for understanding the 1980s reforms. It wasn't happening in a vacuum.
Not at all. There was this long cultural and institutional precedent for the state playing an active role in the economy.
Okay, let's shift gears now, and maybe continents. It's fascinating how the source material connects economic thinking on price controls in Europe and America directly to wartime experiences, particularly World War II in the U.S.
It really is striking. These wartime pressures forced economists and policymakers to grapple with inflation and resource allocation in ways that produced some really interesting and sometimes conflicting ideas that echo later debates.
Take John Maynard Keynes, for example. In his 1940 pamphlet, How to Pay for the War, he kind of flips his usual script, doesn't he?
He completely does. He radically departs from his famous principle of effective demand from the general theory. In wartime, he argues, the size of the cake is fixed, meaning the economy is already running at full capacity for the war effort. If we work harder, we can fight better, but we must not consume more.
So more spending wouldn't create more goods, just higher prices, inflation.
Exactly. He saw that expanded spending would just lead to inflation because production couldn't keep up with consumer demand and war demand. Interestingly, though, he was skeptical about using just price controls and rationing to solve this.
Why is that?
He believed they'd just redirect people's spending power towards whatever goods weren't controlled, leading to distortions and still fueling inflation in those sectors. He actually favored something called deferred pay, basically, forced saving.
Forced saving, how would that work?
The idea was to withdraw excess purchasing power from workers through mandatory savings, which would then be paid back to them after the war. It was his preferred way to soak up inflationary pressure without, in his view, distorting the market too much with direct controls.
But the actual American experience during WWII with the Office of Price Administration, the OPA, that seems to tell a different story about the effectiveness of controls, doesn't it? Let's talk about John Kenneth Galbraith. He was a key figure there, right? The main price fixer.
He certainly was one of the most prominent figures at the OPA, and he described their approach not as following some grand theory, but as feeling its way from case to case, in an evolutionary development.
Yeah.
Very pragmatic.
And he had this fascinating insight about where controls worked best.
Yes, this is really interesting. Galbraith found, through practical experience, that price controls were actually easier to implement and enforce in industries with imperfect competition.
Easier where there wasn't perfect competition.
Exactly. Where you had just a few big buyers or sellers, maybe industries where suppliers set prices, rather than discovering them in a perfectly competitive market.
Yeah.
He found it was much easier for the OPA to control the price of, say, steel from major mills than it was to control the price of steel scrap, which came from thousands of dispersed small suppliers.
That completely contradicts the standard economic thinking of the time.
You really did. The prevailing assumption was that controls would only work, if at all, in highly competitive markets. Galbraith's practical experience suggested the opposite. It was a pragmatic observation that challenged the dominant theory.
And despite these theoretical debates and initial difficulties, the OPA was surprisingly successful in stabilizing prices, wasn't it?
Remarkably so. Their hold-the-line policy, which started in April 1943, enforced a general price freeze. And the result was impressive stability. The official cost of living index rose less than 2% per year between 1943 and 1945, a major achievement during total war.
And here's another fascinating link back to China.
Yes. The U.S. also used a public granary and cotton stock system during the war. And this system was explicitly inspired by the age-old Chinese practice, particularly the ever-normal granaries we just talked about.
Really? Inspired by China?
Directly inspired. Henry Wallace, who was Secretary of Agriculture and later Vice President, knew about the Chinese system and implemented something similar. It helped stabilize agricultural prices, absorbing surpluses and releasing stocks when needed, precisely because direct price control was really hard in the fragmented farm sector. It's a clear echo of that ancient Chinese pragmatism.
That's incredible, a direct policy transfer across centuries and continents. Okay, so controls worked reasonably well during the war. What happened afterwards, when they tried to decontrol?
Well, after Japan surrendered in August 45, President Truman wanted to move towards rapid decontrol, get back to a peacetime economy. But Congress, despite quite strong public support for keeping some controls and warnings from economists like Bernard Baruch, failed to pass an effective extension of the price control laws.
And the result?
Immediate and dramatic inflation. Prices just shot up. One index of 28 important commodities jumped 35% in just 6 days in July 1946, when controls briefly lapsed. Consumer price inflation hit 14.5% in 1947, a real shock to the system.
It sounds very much like the Big Bang outcome we discussed in Russia, just in a different context. What stands out to you about those parallels? And you mentioned earlier, even the German economic miracle wasn't an overnight decontrol of everything.
The parallels are definitely striking. Both the U.S. post-war experience and the Russian transition show the risks of sudden, comprehensive price liberalization, especially when the underlying economy isn't perfectly balanced or stable. And yes, the popular story of the German miracle often glosses over the fact that key prices, like for energy and essential raw materials, remain controlled in West Germany well into the 1970s. It wasn't an overnight free-for-all. It points to a more gradual, managed reality, even in these supposed triumphs of rapid liberalization.
So this post-war experience in the U.S. and the theoretical debates around it really set the stage for that later argument presented to socialist countries that it was either shock therapy or nothing.
Exactly. You had figures like Hayek and von Mises arguing that any price controls were a slippery path, inevitably leading to central planning and, serfdom. Milton Friedman argued that suppressed inflation is worse than open inflation, basically saying you just had to let the system go through a painful boom-bust cycle to correct itself if it got overheated.
For them, any government meddling was inherently bad.
Fundamentally, Hayek famously dismissed the whole idea of stabilizing particular prices. Von Mises argued even controlling the price of milk could start a slide into total socialism. Friedman's view was, if the economy's overheated, let it burn off through open inflation. Trying to suppress it just makes things worse eventually.
But Galbraith had a great counter-argument, didn't he? That whole house overheating analogy.
He did. It's quite clever. He said, look, Instead of just letting the whole house overheat because the furnace is faulty, maybe we should study the house's structure, see where the heat is going. Maybe we can open a window here, turn down a radiator there.
Selective intervention.
Precisely. It wouldn't fix the main furnace problem, he admitted, but it could keep the house livable while you figure out a proper solution for the furnace. It's a defense of pragmatic, targeted controls, exactly the kind of selective approach China would later embrace, rather than the all-or-nothing view.
And the legacy, despite the strong push for pure free market.
Well, the reality is, even in the West, certain price controls remained. Energy, agriculture, rent controls in some places, minimum wages. But intellectually, that fierce debate really laid the groundwork for presenting socialist countries with that stark choice later on. Either a big bang jump to free prices or fall back into central planning. There was seemingly no middle ground offered.
Until China found one, or perhaps rediscovered one from its own history.
Exactly. China managed to escape that prescribed big bang, partly by drawing on its own deep traditions of statecraft, allowing the visible hand, as it were, to guide the invisible hand, creating something genuinely different.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly for China's own experience post-1949. If we connect this back, the loss of control over prices and currency hyperinflation, it wasn't just an economic problem, it was politically devastating. It helped bring down governments, even paving the way for fascism in Germany.
And absolutely crucially, the same dynamic played out in China. The hyperinflation China suffered from roughly 1937 to 1949 was a primary cause of the nationalist government's collapse. By some measures, it was actually worse than the infamous hyperinflations in Weimar Germany or revolutionary Russia.
Worse than Germany's, wow.
Yes, so just as runaway inflation fueled massive political change in Germany, it did so perhaps even more dramatically in China, creating the conditions for the communist victory in 1949.
And conversely, the communists' ability to achieve price stability so quickly, within months of taking power, became a massive source of their legitimacy. It apparently shocked major capitalist powers at the time.
It really did. It was a remarkable feat.
So what went wrong for the nationalists? Why did they fail so spectacularly where the communists succeeded in controlling inflation?
Well, the nationalists faced several interlocking problems. One huge issue was that speculation and hoarding became far more profitable than actual industrial production.
So capital fled industry.
Exactly. Capitalists sought quick profits, speculating on commodity prices, converting gains into gold or foreign currency, often sending it abroad, rather than investing in factories. By 1943, China was actually in an industrial depression amidst the hyperinflation. This fueled a vicious price-wage spiral. They even considered bringing back the ancient salt monopoly to try and stabilize things, but apparently aborted the plan under pressure from their American advisors. They just lacked effective tools like rationing or ways to curb speculation.
So the nationalists, despite that ancient precedent, couldn't or wouldn't really use state power to manage the market effectively. How did the communists approach it differently? The source calls it economic warfare.
They had a very different, much more pragmatic approach. Key figures like Chen Yun, who, remember, becomes a major architect of the 1980s reforms, really emphasized the importance of trade and commodity circulation. He had this famous quote, "A revolutionary businessman is an outright revolutionary." It shows a very practical view of economic activity.
And Shumiquo, another key figure later on.
Yeah, Sumikyo, who also becomes a leading reform economist in the 80s. He devised the stabilization strategy used in the communist base area in Shandong. And his fundamental insight was that you had to use and manipulate market forces, not just fight against them.
And his idea about currency backing was fascinating, not gold, but essential goods.
Incredible insight, wasn't it? Xu argued that during shortages, paper money shouldn't be backed by gold or silver, but by the state's stocks of essential goods, things like grain, cotton cloth, salt.
Because those are what people actually need.
Exactly. His logic was simple and powerful. During a period of material shortage, food and cotton are more valuable than gold and silver, which cannot fill stomachs and protect against the cold. So they used state-run trading companies and cooperatives to control these key commodities, integrating rural and urban economies, aiming for what they termed an organized socialist market. It was about controlling the real goods that underpinned the currency's value.
So how did they actually pull off stabilization after 1949? It defied conventional economics, you said.
It did. The Common Program of 1949, basically the new government's foundational charter, explicitly gave state-owned trading organizations the job of stabilizing prices. And remarkably, they managed to stabilize prices before they fixed the government's budget deficit.
Which is the opposite of what standard theory predicts.
Completely the opposite. Neoclassical economics would say you have to balance the budget first to kill inflation. China did it the other way around. It surprised people like economist Thomas Sargent years later.
How did they do it then? How did they restore faith in paper money?
They tackled the deep distrust of all paper money head-on. They did this by pegging savings deposits and even wages to the wholesale price index of essential commodities, primarily grain and cotton cloth.
Echoes of the Guanxi again.
Direct echoes, linking the currency's value directly to tangible, essential goods. As the state, using its trading networks, stabilized the prices of these key commodities, the value of the currency stabilized too. People regained trust because the money was effectively backed by stuff they needed. Market prices gradually converged towards the official state list prices, and this process helped integrate the national economy.
So it was victory through pragmatic, commodity-backed management, not abstract monetary policy. An incredible story of state intervention working.
Absolutely. Demonstrating the power of controlling those heavy points, as the Guanxi might say, for overall stability.
Okay, that brings us right up to the brink of the main reform era. Let's pivot now to China's market reform debate in the 1980s and how that famous dual-track system emerged from this unique historical and philosophical context.
Right. So the starting point for the reforms of the late 70s and 80s was, of course, the Maoist legacy. The initial phase of industrialization had largely copied the Soviet model, which meant relying heavily on extracting resources from the countryside, from the peasants, through what they called the price scissors. Basically, the state set low prices for agricultural goods it bought from farmers and high prices for industrial goods it sold back to them.
A way to fund industrialization.
Exactly. Now, despite terrible disasters like the Great Leap Forward, it's worth noting that even the World Bank, looking back, judged China's Mao-era development as remarkably successful, in some ways achieving rapid growth, building an industrial base, and eliminating absolute poverty.
But Chinese reformers themselves, by the late 70s, were much more critical, weren't they? People like Hu Qiaomu.
Yes, they were very critical. They pointed to stagnating living standards for many, declining consumption of essential goods, especially for the vast rural population who bore the brunt of the price scissors.
And then came the shift after Mao.
Right. Hua Guofeng's brief leadership after Mao marked a critical turning point. He started redefining revolution as primarily about the liberation of productive forces, prioritizing economic development. This really paved the way for Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun to take the reins and launch the reforms.
The 1978 Third Plenum Communique was key.
Absolutely pivotal. It initiated major changes, significantly increasing the prices the state paid for agricultural goods, lowering the prices of industrial inputs sold to peasants, starting to close those price scissors. Urban grain prices were kept low, though, subsidized by the state. And crucially, it also legitimized small-scale private production and markets, opening the door for experimentation.
So how did they actually approach reform? We hear this famous phrase, groping for stones to cross the river. What did that mean in practice?
Well, Deng Likun, a leading party intellectual at the time, famously critiqued academic economists for being too theoretical, telling them they needed to learn from the practical experience of bureaucrats. And Chen Yun's guiding principle, which Deng Xiaoping fully endorsed, was precisely that. Groping for stones to cross the river. Meaning, don't leap into the unknown. Start with small experiments, pilot projects. See what works, learn from experience, proceed cautiously. Take a step only when you feel firm ground under your feet. This incremental, pragmatic, experimental approach really dominated the first decade of reform, even when faced with calls for faster change.
And it was Somuku, him again, who really articulated the core logic of what became the dual-track price system.
Yes, Su, clearly drawing on those ancient Guanxi principles of light and heavy, proposed the basic idea. The state should continue to control and set prices for the heavy commodities, the vital ones, the ones in short supply. But for the light commodities, those in oversupply or less essential ones, let market forces determine the price.
A two-tiered system.
Exactly. A planned track and a market track existing side by side for the same goods. And early World Bank reports from 1980 confirmed this. They noted China's practical, cautious approach, prioritizing stability above all else, not rushing into ideological blueprints.
That anecdote about the Chengdu handkerchief factory in '79 is quite telling, isn't it? They exceeded their state plan quota.
Right. And instead of just stopping, they used their discretion to design a new handkerchief pattern and sold the surplus through state commerce agencies at a negotiated price. It's a perfect little example of the free disposal of surplus selling above quota output at market or near market prices. That mechanism became central to the dual-track system.
It shows this system emerging organically from the ground up almost.
In many ways, yes. Small experiments bubbling up. Yeah. And you also had these young intellectuals, many of whom had been sent down to the countryside during the Cultural Revolution.
The sent down youth.
Exactly. They formed groups, like the Rural Development Group. Their direct experience of rural poverty made them incredibly dedicated to finding practical reform solutions, pushing for things that actually worked on the ground.
And the agricultural reforms, like the household responsibility system, were a huge success.
Massive success. Giving peasants more control over their land and allowing them to sell surplus produce on the market led to a huge boom in agricultural output and rural incomes in the early 80s.
But not everything was smooth sailing. That failed experiment in Hebei County.
Right. They tried to completely replace state grain procurement with just taxes, and it failed. It actually highlighted how important the state procurement system still was, not just as a tax, but as a stabilizing mechanism. It showed that the dual-track system, where the state still bought grain quotas, was actively dampening price fluctuations just like the old ever-normal granaries. It reinforced the need for gradualism, especially for crucial goods like grain.
So, by 1984, the success in agriculture was building momentum for reform in the cities, in industry.
Definitely. Zhao Ziyang, who was premier then, started shifting his stance, becoming more open to price adjustments. He even praised a plan to adjust textile prices, which had been fixed for 30 years. You see growing confidence.
And the 1984 decision on reform of the economic structure was a landmark.
Huge. It formally adopted the concept of a planned commodity economy. This officially accepted that the law of value, meaning market forces, had a legitimate role to play. It distinguished between mandatory state planning for major products and guidance planning or market regulation for others. It essentially gave official blessing to the dual-track approach that had been evolving.
Then, in early 1985, the dual-track system became official policy for industrial raw materials and fuel.
Yes, that was a major step. They formalized it for core industrial inputs. And significantly, they removed the previous 20% limit on how much prices for above-quota sales could deviate from the state price. This was described as like letting a horse run.
What did that mean in practice?
It meant a rapid increase in the volume of goods being traded at market prices. But inevitably, it also started pushing those market prices up significantly.
And changes in agriculture, too.
Yes. Around the same time, the old unified grain procurement system was temporarily replaced by a contract system. It looked a bit like the old imperial granary system the state contracted to buy grain, shifting its role from just enforcing quotas to being more of a market participant managing supply. Though applying fixed average prices sometimes hurt poorer areas and led to a temporary dip in grain output, showing the need for constant fine-tuning.
So by the mid-'80s, this dual-track system was really at the core of the Chinese economy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It regulated essential goods, industrial inputs, the heart of the economy, and it offered this unique flexibility. You could lean more towards the plan track or more towards the market track, depending on the circumstances. It was built on pragmatism and continuous adjustment, not rigid ideology.
It really was a system designed for navigating complexity.
A defining characteristic of China's transition. It allowed state control where deemed necessary and market dynamism where possible. A true hybrid.
Okay, this brings us to a really dramatic period, the mid to late 1980s. This is where we see a major clash of ideas, a real tension between China's gradualist path and a strong internal push for something much faster, much closer to shock therapy.
Yes, this was a absolutely critical juncture. Different intellectual currents really collided. One of the leading voices pushing for a more rapid shock therapy-style reform was the economist Wu Jinglian.
And his view was quite different from the groping for stones approach.
Very different. He essentially believed that groping for stones was now obsolete. He felt Chinese economists had absorbed enough scientific economic knowledge, by which he largely meant Western mainstream economics, which he'd studied intensively, including time at Yale. He thought they now had the theoretical tools to design a comprehensive reform package.
So influenced by Western economists like Janos Kornai, he advocated for what? An all-out reform.
Exactly. He argued for one brave surgery on the price system, a big bang approach to get rid of the dual track system and liberalize prices quickly.
How did this group see the problem of inflation, which was starting to become a concern in the late 80s?
They saw it primarily as a problem of aggregate excess demand. Too much money chasing too few goods, fueled by, in their view, an overly loose money supply after 1986.
And their solution?
Strict macroeconomic austerity, tight monetary policy, cut government spending, make the central bank independent, basically cool down the whole economy as preparation for the big bang price liberalization. They saw the dual-track system as this messy, incoherent hybrid that bred corruption and inefficiency and just needed to be abolished fast. Their focus, much like those ancient literati perhaps, was on achieving an ideal model, either pure market or pure plan, not this mixed reality.
But the gradualists, particularly those around the System Reform Institute, mounted a strong defense of their approach, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. They pushed back hard. Led by figures advised by people like Wang Xiaoqiang, they argued that just liberalizing prices without fixing the underlying institutional problems first would be disastrous.
What specific problems?
Especially the problem of state-owned enterprises, SOEs. SOEs operated under what they called soft budget constraints. They weren't really subject to hard profit and loss discipline. They could always expect government bailouts. They couldn't easily fire workers or go bankrupt.
So what would happen if you just freed prices?
The gradualists argued the SOEs wouldn't respond by becoming more efficient. They'd just use their market power to raise prices, knowing they wouldn't go under. This would lead to accelerating inflation and destroy the industrial core, not lead to some neat market equilibrium. Li Jiang, another key figure, argued China was in structural disequilibrium and achieving an equilibrium of poverty through harsh austerity wasn't the goal.
Their approach sounds much more focused on the messy realities.
It was. Their research involved extensive surveys, working with sociologists, political scientists, really trying to integrate theory with practice. And they found crucial supporting evidence by looking at other socialist countries that had reformed earlier.
Like Hungary and Yugoslavia.
Exactly. Those countries had seen an initial golden age after some limited market reforms. But the gradualist research showed that when they later went for full liberalization of input prices, it led to runaway inflation and industrial decline. It seemed to prove the gradualist point. A big bang was incredibly risky if you hadn't reformed the enterprises first.
And they even got some validation from West Germany.
Yes, this is fascinating. A West German economist, Hans-Karl Schneider, who had actually worked under Ludwig Erhard during Germany's post-war economic miracle, came to China and warned them. He said, look, even Germany's success didn't involve rapidly deregulating essential energy and raw material prices. Those data controlled well into the 1970s. This directly challenged the simplistic Big Bang narrative often told about Germany and gave real weight to the gradualist argument in China.
Meanwhile, Premier Zhao Ziyang was pursuing his coastal development strategy, another gradualist step.
Absolutely. In late 87, early 88, Zhao launched this strategy focused on integrating coastal regions into the global economy through labor-intensive exports. It was essentially extending the dual-track logic using market mechanisms, but in a geographically focused, managed way. Zhao saw inflation not just as an overall problem, but one of sectoral imbalances. He consistently emphasized price stability and the vital role of state commerce in achieving it, clear echoes of the Guanxi again.
It's striking that even reform skeptics like Li Peng agreed on the need for controlling inflation, even if they disagreed on what came next.
Yes, there was a broad consensus, even among factions who disagreed fiercely on the pace and direction of reform, that macroeconomic stability was paramount. The real fight was over how to achieve it and what the next steps should be after stabilization.
This intense debate then built up to this incredibly dramatic moment, the aborted Big Bang of 1988.
A real turning point. In May 1988, Deng Xiaoping himself seemed to throw his weight behind radical price reform. He started lobbying for it, using metaphors like urging China to meet the stormy waves head-on, saying reforms needed to be completed in 3 to 5 years.
What prompted this shift in Deng's thinking, seemingly?
Well, partly there was growing frustration with the problems of the dual-track system, like corruption. Also, a high-level delegation had just visited Latin America. They were led by Qin Yuzhi and Zhu Jiaming. They saw countries like Brazil with higher GDP per capita, seemingly managing high inflation alongside growth and poverty programs. This led some reformers back home to perhaps underestimate the risks, to think maybe high inflation was just an inevitable, manageable growing pain for new market economies.
But the System Reform Institute, Chen Yizi, Wang Xiaoqiang, the gradualists, they were sounding the alarm.
Loudly and clearly. They submitted 6 reports warning vehemently against Deng's proposed price reform program. They argued it would be an absolute disaster without fixing the enterprise and banking systems first. They predicted, very accurately, that uncontrolled liberalization would trigger panic buying, social unrest, and ultimately undermine the entire reform project.
And yet, the decision was made.
Despite these stark warnings, on August 17, 1988, the Politburo went ahead and adopted a preliminary plan for price and wage reform. The goal was explicit: abolish the dual-track system, liberalize prices for core industrial inputs and consumer goods. They even predicted a 70% price rise over 5 years, which they planned to offset with wage increases.
And the public reaction when this was announced?
It was immediate and catastrophic. The public announcement on August 19th just shattered trust. Panic buying erupted across the country. People rushed out to buy anything: durable TVs, refrigerators, washing machines, even air conditioners in Kunming, the city of eternal spring. They were trying to convert their savings into real goods before prices skyrocketed.
And this panic buying itself fueled inflation further.
Exactly. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy, spiraling into social unrest. It showed just how fragile public confidence was and how deeply people feared instability.
So how did the state regain control in late 1988? How did they put the brakes on?
They moved quickly and decisively, guided again by Chen Yun's old principle: control the most essential goods. Back to the Guanxi's heavy points. By reasserting state control over the prices and distribution of critical commodities, grain, cotton, coal, steel, they managed to stabilize the situation. Inflation was brought back under control within about a year.
A dramatic reversal.
A huge reversal. It was a powerful, practical demonstration that the gradualists had been right about the risks of a premature Big Bang. And it showed the enduring power of China's specific model of state capacity to intervene and stabilize, focusing on those key economic levers rather than trying to control everything or letting everything go at once.
This brings us, inevitably, to a very somber but crucial chapter: the political consequences that spiraled into the Tiananmen Square protests of 1989 and their tragic aftermath. That combination of the failed Big Bang attempt in '88 and the harsh policy reversal afterwards must have really deepened the existing tensions.
It absolutely did. The runaway inflation of '88 hit urban residents particularly hard, eroding trust not just in the currency but in the whole market reform process. It amplified anxieties about corruption, inequality, the growing commodification of daily life. At the same time, those who had benefited from market opportunities felt threatened by the sudden tightening of state controls.
So a really complex mix of grievances.
Incredibly complex. And this formed the volatile backdrop for the massive social movement that erupted in the spring of 1989. It's crucial to remember that the protesters had diverse demands. Yes, calls for democratic rights and an end to corruption, but also, very significantly, a deep desire for price stability. The economic turmoil was a major factor.
And amidst this incredibly tense situation, the actions of Zhao Ziyang, who was general secretary of the party then, stand out. His visit to Tiananmen Square.
It was a remarkable moment. On May 18, 1989, with Soviet leader Gorbachev actually visiting Beijing, Zhao went to Tiananmen Square in the early hours. He spoke directly to the hunger-striking students.
What did he say?
He famously apologized for the leadership coming too late. He pleaded with them to end the hunger strike, to live to see China modernize. He pledged the government would never close the door to dialogues. It was an incredibly poignant and courageous act. He knew Deng Xiaoping and others were preparing to impose martial law, and Zhao was essentially willing to sacrifice his career rather than endorse a crackdown.
And the young reform economists, the ones Zhao had supported, they took a stand too.
They did. The research institutes most closely associated with the gradualist reformist wing, the three institutes in one association, including the System Reform Institute, they openly supported the protesters. They issued statements calling for a peaceful, legitimate resolution to the crisis, warning that the leadership was becoming divorced from the popular will. They distributed tens of thousands of copies across Beijing. It was a very brave public stand.
What happened to Zhao Ziyang and these reformers afterwards?
Zhao Ziyang was removed from power and placed under house arrest on May 28, 1989. He remained confined until his death in 2005. And after the military crackdown on June 4th, that era of relatively open debate and influence for many of those young reform economists came to a brutal end. Many fled the country, some were imprisoned, others just faded from public life, perhaps going into private business.
A real turning point.
A tragic turning point. And it also kicked off this ongoing struggle over the interpretation of the 1980s. Figures like Wu Jinglian, the shock therapy advocate, and Zhu Jieming, one of the delegation leaders who visited Latin America, later offered very different narratives about who was responsible for the 1988 crisis and the subsequent events.
Right.
That debate about the meaning of the 80s continues even today. It just underscores the immense political stakes intertwined with these economic choices.
Absolutely. This entire deep dive into how China escaped shark therapy has been just incredibly illuminating. So pulling it all together, what are the main takeaways? What should you, our listener, really remember from this complex story?
Well, I think one huge takeaway is that China's path, culminating in the idea of a socialist market economy with Chinese characteristics, formally adopted in 1992, really demonstrated something crucial. It showed that state control and market mechanisms could be integrated. They weren't necessarily mutually exclusive, as the dominant Western narrative often suggested. You could have a hybrid system that worked not necessarily perfectly, but effectively enough to manage a massive transition.
And that ancient Guanxian principle controlling the heavy, letting go of the light, that seems absolutely fundamental to the success of the dual track system, doesn't it? That ancient wisdom finding a modern application.
It really does. That underlying pragmatism, focusing on what was feasible, on managing the crucial points of the economy rather than chasing an ideological ideal of a pure market or pure plan, was key. It allowed for these historic transformations without triggering complete collapse. China kept control over the commanding heights, energy, finance, key industries, while allowing market forces to revitalize other areas.
Even the later price liberalizations in the early 90s, the so-called small bang, were different because of this foundation.
Exactly. That period did see inflation rise faster than growth for a while, but it avoided the hyperinflationary disaster seen in Russia. And that's largely because it happened after years of gradual marketization through the dual-track system, and crucially, after the state had reasserted its capacity for control in 88-89, the foundations were different. The state retained the ability to manage the process.
So thinking about today, what does this all mean for you, our listener? What's the broader relevance of China's very unique economic journey?
I think China's experience offers a really powerful counter-narrative. It challenges that widely held belief, especially dominant in the 90s, that radical simultaneous liberalization shock therapy is the only way, or the best way, to transition an economy. It highlights the immense importance of context, of history, of specific institutional legacies, and crucially, a willingness to experiment and adapt economic theory to real-world conditions.
It's a case for pragmatism over dogma.
Very much so. It's a testament to incrementalism, to learning by doing groping for stones, rather than rigidly applying abstract models. It suggests there probably isn't one single blueprint for successful economic reform that fits all countries at all times.
Which leaves us with a really important question, doesn't it? In a world still grappling with huge economic transformations, with globalization, with the need to balance growth and stability, how might other nations learn from China's experience? Not necessarily copying it wholesale, because the context is always unique, but learning from that historically informed approach to managing change, integrating into the global economy while maintaining some control over your own destiny.
That ability to selectively intervene, to harness market forces rather than just being overwhelmed by them, and doing so with a deep understanding of your own history and institutions. It definitely offers a rich field for thought. It challenges us all, I think, to reconsider the standard narratives about economic development and perhaps adopt a more nuanced, historically grounded perspective.
What a journey indeed. Thank you so much for unpacking all of that for us.
My pleasure. It's a fascinating and important story.
Absolutely. And thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep digging deeper.